Ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite Datuk Jayasiri, the Deputy Secretary General for Strategy and Monitoring, Ministry of International Trade and Industry Malaysia, who is also the lead negotiator for TPPA, to deliver his keynote address. Welcome, Dato.
Saudari dan saudara pengacara majlis, saudara Syahrizan, saudara Johan, ladies and gentlemen, selamat pagi, selamat sejahtera, dan salam satu Malaysia. I know it's tough sacrificing a Sunday morning to be here. I too was struggling to get up and be here by 9 o'clock. But what this reflects is that you are a responsible lot, that you have taken the initiative to be here, to learn about the TPPA, so that you can think for yourself and not let others do the thinking for you. And I think the call made by Saudara Syahrizan is very apt. Don't be emotional about this. Think for yourself the merits and the concerns and the challenges that the TPPA brings. So today's roundtable is basically to enable you all to have a better appreciation of the provisions that we have in the TPPA. The order of things is slightly different. It says there, opening address by me. Mine is not going to be an opening address. I'm going to take the liberty of explaining most of the chapters, especially the controversial ones, and then my fellow lead negotiators will do some of the specific market access, the IPR, and the state-owned enterprise chapters, because these are the areas where there was a request that there be detailed explanation. Okay? The order of things, like I said, is a little bit not as what it should be, because the minister always starts off by explaining why Malaysia needs to be in the TPPA and what if we are not in the TPPA. But I believe he's going to come later in the evening to do that. Okay? So this morning's session is going to be purely an explanatory session, and I have, I think, about 1.5 hours. So once I finish my presentation, I believe before the next speaker comes in, there will be an opportunity for you all to raise any questions that you have. All right? So are you all settled? Are you feeling comfortable? Feeling very tense? No, just relax, okay? This is not as difficult as your undergraduate studies, okay? This is a subject which even the common man understands or tries to understand, okay? Now, the Trans-Pacififc Partnership Agreement actually started the negotiations in March 2010, okay? And Malaysia joined the negotiations in October 2010, 3 months, at the third round of the negotiations. It took us 5 years to conclude these negotiations. Now, a lot of people have been saying that this is a US-driven agenda and that the agreement is all about US proposals. Now, if it was just the US proposals that the other 11 countries accepted, the negotiations would have been over in a couple of months or in a year. The fact that it took 5 years showed that countries were actually negotiating and not just accepting proposals. Okay? So that's a little bit of the background why it took so long, 5 years. 12 countries, different levels of development, different ambitions, and different capacities. So you will find that in the negotiations, some of these are taken on board in the outcome of the negotiations, a reflection of the different levels of development and capacities of the different countries. So let me now start by just giving you an overview of the chapters. We've got 30 chapters in this trade agreement. Now this is a very comprehensive trade agreement, and that itself is the reason why there's been a lot of controversy and interest in this subject, because there are a number of issues that Malaysia is negotiating for the first time. Okay? Now if you see that the standard legal chapters in any international trade agreement, you will have the standard legal chapters. Okay? The preambular language, the initial provisions, then you will have the institutional and administrative arrangements, how eventually the agreement is going to be implemented. Then you will have provisions on dispute settlement. All international trade agreements will have dispute settlement provisions if they are binding agreements. Otherwise, you will have no recourse to settle disputes. Then you have exceptions and general provisions. The exceptions is an important chapter because it tells you what are the departures from the main provisions of the agreement. Final provisions are those that tell you what you can do in order to get out of the agreement, what provisions you will have in terms of new members joining the agreement. Okay? So these are standard legal provisions. Now, the middle column are really the trade issues. And if you notice here, most of these chapters are already found in the World Trade Organization. Okay? The WTO have got all, if not many of these chapters covered in the agreement. So you would have probably read some of the critics of the TPPA saying, why is Malaysia in this trade agreement when there are only 5 trade chapters? So I'm here now showing you what the traditional trade areas are in the TPP. And that should put to rest this issue about only 5 trade chapters in the TPP. People are still writing and saying that there are only 5 trade chapters in the TPP. See for yourself. Market access for goods is a chapter by itself. Rules of origin. Rules of origin tells you which country can enjoy preferential treatment if they follow the rules of origin. The rules of origin simply determines where a product originates from. Okay? Textiles and apparel is a chapter by itself. It tells you what kind of conditions that textiles will be liberalized and preferential treatment given. What are the conditions under which monitoring takes place in the textiles chapter? Customs administration, here again is a traditional trade issue. Trade remedies. Trade remedies are recourse. Trade remedies are recourse that a member will have if another party takes an offensive measure. For instance, if we have a dumping product affecting your industry, so what is the recourse that you will have? These are called trade remedies. Anti-dumping measures, countervailing measures to offset subsidies, and safeguard measures. So these are called trade remedies, and it is a trade issue. Okay? Sanitary and phytosanitary measures. These are measures taken to ensure that human, animal and plant life is protected when there is a disease outbreak, for instance. Okay? Technical barriers to trade. These are technical regulations that govern the flow of trade for security, for safety, consumer protection. So these are technical barriers to trade that is already found in the World Trade Organization, and in all countries there are technical regulations in place to protect consumers. Investment is a trade issue. Cross-border services, financial services. These are all traditional trade issues. Temporary entry. Temporary entry is basically some procedures to deal with application for visas when you have, say, access to carry out work in another country. Okay? So this is basically a facilitative chapter. Then you have telecommunications, e-commerce. Now, government procurement is already in the WTO. It is not an agreement which all WTO members are party to, but you have the ability to join that agreement. Okay? Right now, Malaysia is an observer in the Government Procurement Committee, but we are not a member yet. There are, I think, about 40 over members only in the WTO. But the fact is, it is already a WTO issue. So we have not included government procurement in any of our 13 free trade agreements that we have today. So that's a new issue for us, and it's one of the most difficult, very controversial issue that we negotiated in the TPP. Competition policy. This is about how competition laws are applied to ensure that there is consumer protection. Okay? And Malaysia did not have competition policy in most of our past free trade agreements because we did not have a competition law. We only recently had a competition law established. So now we are in a position to negotiate competition policy in the TPP and in any future FTAs. Intellectual property right is already in the WTO. Okay, IPR protection for patents, copyrights, geographical indications. These are some of the issues which Saudara Borhan will relate to you afterwards. Cooperation and capacity building. Now these are facilitative measures in the agreement. In Malaysia's 13 free trade agreements, we always make sure that there is provision on cooperation and capacity building. This is something that countries can use to build capacity so that their own companies, especially the smaller ones, SMEs, can take advantage of market opening and liberalization that trade agreements provide. Competitiveness and business facilitation. This is a chapter which may not be in the WTO, but remnants, or you can find segments of this chapter in different parts of the WTO agreements. This is about how the parties ensure that in the global supply chain or the regional supply chain, there are no impediments for countries to trade and do business. So these are the traditional trade issues. So I hope you are convinced that the TPP is not just 5 trade issues. It's definitely more than 5 trade issues. Now the new issues for Malaysia, the first one there is competition. Competition has got 2 segments. In the chapter 1, section A is competition policy. The other one now is competition on SOEs. So we decided to have a separate chapter on state-owned enterprises. Now, state-owned enterprises, I'm sure you know what state-owned enterprises are. Maybe you can relate to some of them. Some of you maybe come from state-owned enterprises. GLCs, for instance, government-linked companies. Okay, give you an example. Khazanah is a state-owned enterprise. Petronas even is a state-owned enterprise. State-owned enterprise is an enterprise where the government holds majority share or the government has a controlling interest in an entity. That's what in the TPP the definition of a state-owned enterprise is. Okay? Labor and environment are two new issues for Malaysia. We have not discussed labor and environment extensively in any of our free trade agreements. I believe there may be some elements of cooperation on the chapter of environment in our past FTAs, but nothing substantive and binding obligations are found in those agreements. So this is for the first time that we are negotiating labor and environment. Development is actually a chapter that is beneficial to developing countries in the TPP, and this is something that is not subject to dispute settlement. It is more a facilitative chapter in the TPP. SMEs, this is an important chapter. For the first time, in my experience, I have still not come across any free trade agreement that has got a dedicated chapter on SMEs. So you'll find a dedicated chapter on SMEs in the TPP. And this chapter provides a platform for countries to cooperate to help SMEs integrate into the global supply chain. It helps SMEs to build capacity. It helps SMEs to understand better what are the requirements to do business in other TPP countries. So that's why SMEs, the chapter is an important chapter for developing countries or countries that have a lot of SMEs, and for which we find that SMEs can take advantage of. A dedicated website will be created where all information will be shared among the TPP countries to be able to understand better trading requirements. Regulatory coherence. Now this is something which may give the impression that all the TPP countries are going to have coherent regulatory measures. No, that's not the provision in the TPP. Regulatory coherence is simply about good regulatory practices. It simply means that now, when the government comes up, say, with a new regulation or is proposing to amend a regulation or law, it must give an opportunity for its stakeholders to participate by providing views, comments, which the government will have to take on board. So that's good regulatory practices, and that's what we call regulatory coherence. And the purpose of having regulatory coherence is that when you establish regulations or you amend your regulations, you must ensure that it doesn't negate other areas where you have actually committed to do something or you have liberalized the economy. Okay? So that's the meaning of regulatory coherence. Contrary to what people say that this is going to achieve uniform regulations across TPP countries. No, that can never happen. Okay? Even in some of the trade unions, for instance, like the EU, customs unions, sorry, not trade unions, customs unions like the European Union, you still do not find a complete harmonization of regulatory measures. Okay? You still find different countries having some leeway in coming up with their own regulations. And finally, we have a provision chapter on transparency and anti-corruption. This is good governance. Okay? We have never had any of our free trade agreements having provisions on transparency and anti-corruption. Okay? I think you all know what corruption leads to. So having some commitments here in the TPP on anti-corruption clearly shows that the TPP members are aiming to have good governance instilled through the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Okay? Now, I'm not sure how I need to proceed. I leave it to the organizers. Do I wait till I finish and then take questions? Or if somebody has a burning desire to ask something, please don't stop yourself. just raise your hands and shoot. Okay? Now, let me go through very quickly an overview of some of the provisions or the chapters. I will start with the legal and institutional issues, because this is basically the enabling provisions that will see the effective operations of the whole agreement. Okay? Now, entry into force. Here again, a lot of people have said that, oh, Malaysia in Atlanta, when we concluded the negotiations, have signed the agreement. The Economist, some of you may have read, The Economist was delayed in circulation. The last copy was delayed. The circulation of the last copy was delayed. And the reason was, they said that Malaysia signed the agreement in Atlanta. That's a blatant lie. And we got them to change or correct that. And after they corrected it, only then they circulated it. Okay? No country has signed the TPP yet. We all concluded it in Atlanta on 5th of October. And after cleaning up the text, we distributed or we released it to the public. Simultaneously, all countries at the same time released it on 5th of November. The 5th of November, it became a public document. And it is still not signed. Signing has to be done collectively. It's not just an individual country deciding to sign. So we have come up with a tentative date in early February to sign the agreement. Okay? Of course, Malaysia has got its own procedure to follow before we sign that agreement. But signing itself doesn't mean that the agreement can be implemented. Okay? Signing is an indication that now we are prepared to undertake our domestic procedures in order for the agreement to be implemented. And that's what we call a ratification process. So after we sign the agreement, countries will go back to have their own domestic procedures in place. For instance, establishing institutional arrangements to implement the agreement, changing laws where it is necessary, and in some countries maybe we will have to enact new laws. Fortunately, we negotiated in such a way that we would not have to enact any new laws. All we need to do is to change some of our laws. Okay? Later on you will find that in IPR we will have some substantive changes to make, because the coverage in IPR is quite wide. And in the area of labor laws in Malaysia have not been amended for quite a while now. Okay, some of them are really a few dozen years old. So we have actually, even before the TPP, have been reviewing some of our labor laws. So labor is another area where we will have to have some significant changes to our laws. So all these things will have to be done before we can ratify the agreement. Now, only after ratification will the agreement enter into force. Okay? Now, what is the procedure for entry into force? The agreement says that 60 days after all the countries have ratified, it will come into force. Okay? And if within 2 years, 24 months, if all the 12 countries have not ratified the agreement, it still will not come into force. So we will go to the next condition. The next condition says that at least 6 countries. The reason why we chose 6 is because 12 countries, we said 50% of the countries, the original signatories, must ratify. But that's not all the condition there is. We must get at least 85% of the combined GDP of the 12 countries. 6 plus 85% of the combined GDP. Only then will the agreement come into force 60 days after that condition is met. Okay? Now, if that condition is not met, then we will continue to wait until we get 6 countries accounting for 85%. Okay? So that's the conditions that need to be met before the agreement enters into force. Now, when the agreement enters into force, there will be some institutional arrangements within the 12 parties that needs to be established. The first thing is the TPP Commission. In most international agreements, you will have arrangements, some more permanent, some virtual, some on an ad hoc basis. But this TPP Commission will be like the supreme body that oversees the agreement. Then we will have many subsidiary bodies, like respective chapters will have working groups established, committees established. But the TPP Commission is the supreme body. We currently do not have plans to establish any secretariat, okay? ASEAN has got a secretariat, APEC has a secretariat, but for the TPP, we do not have plans to establish a secretariat yet. If at all we establish a secretariat, it could be a virtual secretariat, just to be more efficient and keep costs down, okay? So what does this TPP Commission do? Like I said, it is a supreme body. It will comprise a representative from each of the TPP countries, and they will be actually responsible for the overall implementation of the agreement. And one of the most important functions of the TPP Commission is that when there is a dispute regarding the agreement itself, then you will have the TPP Commission doing an interpretation. The interpretation given by the TPP Commission would be binding upon the tribunal. So this means that the tribunal has got no freedom to willy-nilly interpret the agreement as they like. They have to take the interpretation provided by the TPP Commission. So the interpretation of the agreement can only be done by governments, the 12 countries that negotiated the agreement, not by an independent tribunal. You follow that? That's a very important provision that we have in the TPP as a task of the TPP Commission. Now, accession. Many of you are interested to know why China is being out of the TPP, why is Indonesia not there, okay? Now, the TPP is not about 12 countries only forming this trade agreement. It is actually an open-ended agreement which gives preference to APEC members. APEC is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Okay? APEC comprise 21 economies today. So all these 21 economies are eligible to be members of the TPP. They can accede to the TPP agreement later. And of course, in order to accede to the TPP agreement, you have to accept the scope that has been negotiated, the standards that have been negotiated, okay? And accession is also open to non-APEC members if all the parties agree to. Assuming India is not currently are not a APEC member, if they want to join the TPP, then the members will have to decide whether they can accept India or not. Okay? Because the priority or the preference is for APEC members. And of course, the procedures to accede will have to be decided by the TPP members. And it is something which is quite onerous. If you have been following accession to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, you will notice that China took, I think, about 14 years for them to join the WTO. Vietnam, Russia, they are all late entries to the WTO. And they took a long time to negotiate, and they had to pay a heavy price. Okay? They had to make a lot of concessions before they could become members. So it's the same in the TPP. If you are an original member, you have the first mover advantage. If you come in later, you will have to pay a much heavier price. Just a very simple analogy is that if you are a founder member of a club, you probably pay $200 entrance fees. 5 years down the road, conditions would have been imposed for new members. Okay? The later you come in, the higher your cost of entry. Same for the TPP. But the important thing is that TPP has an accession clause which will allow countries to join. Withdrawal. A lot of people ask, what happens if Malaysia wants to withdraw from the agreement? By all means, you can do that, but you have certain consequences. If you are a member, you have obligations because you have made some commitments, but at the same time you enjoy a lot of rights. You get preferential access, you get a liberalized market of 800 million people, but if you withdraw, you lose all your rights. You cannot enjoy your preferential access. So the only condition that you have to do is that you have to give notice 6 months in advance before your withdrawal. Exceptions. I mentioned that an exceptions chapter is there in the TPP, and these are the exceptions that we have. General exceptions basically is taken from the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the WTO, general exception on provision for security reasons, health, environment, exhaustion of natural resources. These are all the general exceptions that you find the same that you find in the WTO. Security exceptions, yes, again, most trade agreements or international agreements will have security exceptions. Safeguard measures, we have got temporary safeguard measures. In textiles, we have got temporary safeguard measures. In market access, we have got temporary safeguard measures. Taxation measures, some of the taxation measures are, there are exemptions. Applicability of the Treaty of Waitangi. How many of you know what this is? How many of you studied in New Zealand? Anyone studied in New Zealand? You see, the Treaty of Waitangi is something similar to the Bumiputra preference policy that we have. It's just that our Bumiputra policy's preference is not contained in a single piece of legislation. Our preference is through announcements, through the 5-year master development plans. Sometimes it's a cabinet decision, sometimes it's a budget decision where and on an administrative basis, preferences are given to Bumiputras, okay? But in the New Zealand context, they have what we call a Treaty of Waitangi that gives preference to the, who are the preference receiving community there. Yes, the Maoris, okay? So that's called the Treaty of Waitangi, and New Zealand has actually taken an exception to the Treaty of Waitangi. So anything in the TPP cannot affect that piece of legislation, okay? And disclosure of information. We make sure that although there are transparency requirements, the disclosure of information must ensure that confidential business information should not be revealed. or disclose. Okay, so these are the kind of provisions that you have for general exceptions. Now let me explain a few horizontal issues that cuts across some of the chapters. These are not specific chapters, but these are issues that you find in a number of chapters, which Malaysia has negotiated specifically for Malaysia. For instance, we have got, for the Bumiputra preference policies, we have negotiated flexibilities where we have a 30% set aside for construction services. We have to open up our GP market, but at the same time, we have carved out 30% set aside for Bumiputras. And Bumiputra suppliers will still continue to enjoy the margin of preference. And there is what we call a central contract where a list of items are contained. And these are again preferences for Bumiputras. And all these are going to be maintained. Okay? It is not negotiated away. And if we practice this preference, nobody can take us to dispute. State-owned enterprises, I think Saudara Aruna will later on explain to you. Here again, to help small and medium enterprises, to help Bumiputra enterprises, to help suppliers in Sabah and Sarawak, we have carved out a 40% flexibility for state-owned enterprises, which means state-owned enterprises can buy from all these enterprises or entities up to 40% of their annual purchases without having to observe the SOE disciplines. Okay? So this is something that we have negotiated to continue to help SMEs and Bumiputra companies. Non-conforming measures, I'll go into detail later on. Non-conforming measures, the fact that it says non-conforming means it is something that you do and it does not conform to the commitments. Because we cannot conform to the commitments, we take a reservation and we call these non-conforming measures. So Malaysia has taken a number of non-conforming measures when it comes to issues in services liberalization and investment liberalization. Next. SMEs, I've already mentioned the state-owned enterprises. Even in financial services that small and micro enterprises can have assistance provided by some of the financial institutions, and they get an exemption from the TPP commitments. Sovereignty is another big issue. Everybody says that kita jual negara, you know, we are losing our sovereignty. Why is it only Malaysia is losing sovereignty? There are 11 other countries that are negotiating. Don't they lose their sovereignty when they conclude these negotiations? So I think sovereignty have to be looked in the proper context. Okay, we joined the WTO. There are now 161 members in the WTO. Does it mean that 161 countries have lost their sovereignty because they joined the WTO and took on commitments? Okay, so sovereignty has to be looked at it in a proper context. First, we have negotiated this agreement in such a way that we do not have to change our constitution. Nothing in this agreement makes us change our constitution. Okay? Secondly, the rights of the individual states. I think those who have done law will know that the states have got authority over certain matters. So all those are preserved under the TPP. Okay, those are real sovereignty issues. Okay, now, in addition to that, we have the right to regulate. The TPP doesn't take away that right from government. Okay, that's about sovereignty. So to say that the TPP takes away the sovereignty is actually a very sweeping statement which is not substantiated. Okay. Next. I was planning to give you an overview of trade in goods, the market access component, but I'm going to shift and move away from this topic because Saudara Shahril will go to you in detail later on market access. Okay? all the provisions on market access, what are our commitments, what are we getting from other countries, how much of benefits we are getting, and what are the rules, what are the exceptions that we have got through these negotiations. Shahril will provide to you in greater detail. So I will skip this. Next. Now, non-conforming measures. I mentioned to you just now about non-conforming measures. Now, in the investment chapter, in the services chapter, there are certain commitments, obligations that we have. We have to provide market access. That means we have to open up our regimes. And we have to make sure there is national treatment. National treatment means anything that is local, you must treat it no different from foreign investors or service providers. Okay? That's called national treatment. You cannot discriminate against a foreign product or a foreign service. Okay? So those are obligations that we have in the investment and services chapter. And in addition to that, we have got certain performance requirements that we have to observe. Okay? For instance, we can't impose conditions like if you come in and invest in Malaysia, you must export all your products. Or if you come and invest in Malaysia, you must only use local materials. These are all performance requirements. Okay? So these are obligations or commitments that we have. Now, because in some sectors we can't observe or keep to these commitments, so we take a reservation. Because we can't conform, we have a list of non-conforming measures. So some of the non-conforming measures are listed here. These are not all the non-conforming measures. This is just an illustrative list. For instance, the Bumiputra preference. We want to practice the Bumiputra preference across most of the sectors. For instance, we want the ability to continue to give preferential licenses, permits. Okay? So we have taken a non-conforming measure on Bumiputra preferences. Land policies. Land policies are not the purview of the federal government. It is the purview of states. So we take an exception, we take a non-conforming measure because we want to keep that flexibility for the states. Petronas, how many of you work for Petronas? You work for Petronas. Now Petronas is in a very unique position. Petronas is a state-owned enterprise. It's an enterprise, a commercial entity. But at the same time, Petronas is a regulator. Okay, how many of you actually know that? Petronas is a commercial entity and at the same time they are a regulator. This is a unique situation. Normally the regulators are not commercial players, but the PDA, the Petroleum Development Act, was crafted and in such a way the regulatory powers were given to Petronas. So now we have to preserve that. The Petroleum Development Act is a very important act because the whole petroleum industry is regulated through the Petroleum Development Act. So we don't want to commit everything in the TPP and take all the flexibilities that the Petroleum Development Act would require. So we have taken a non-conforming measure on the Petroleum Development Act. Now, right to impose any condition when disposing assets of state-owned enterprise. Sometimes when the government privatizes an entity, the government will want to say that the entity will have to be in the hands of only Malaysians and not to foreigners, for instance. Okay? So the government wants to have that flexibility maintained. Okay? Some strategic sectors, the government wants to make sure that whoever wins the right to run that entity will be efficient, will take into account the public interest and so on. So for that reason, the government wants to have a say who actually has the right to own assets in state-owned enterprises. For that reason, we have also taken a non-conforming measure on this. Okay? MFN exemption for ASEAN preferences. Now, a lot of questions have been asked. With the TPP, where is ASEAN? Where is AEC? Okay? This fact, this exemption itself tells a lot. The fact that we have taken an MFN exemption for ASEAN preferences shows that we still give priority to ASEAN. MFN here means most favored nation. Okay? Most favored nation treatment means if I give something to A, I must give to B, C, D the same treatment. Okay? Which means here in the TPP, if I give to Vietnam, or I give to Singapore, or I give to Thailand or Indonesia, the TPP will want that to be also accorded to the TPP countries. But we have taken an exemption. Anything that we negotiate, a free trade agreement with ASEAN countries, we will maintain that preference for ASEAN countries. We will not extend it to TPP countries. That shows that we have still priority given to ASEAN. Okay? So that's how you should respond. If people ask you, where you have TPP now, what about ASEAN? The fact is that you have taken a reservation and saying that MFN preferences is still for ASEAN. It shows that our priority, number one, is still ASEAN. Okay? Cultural services. Here again, a lot of people say, oh, because of the TPP, gambar-gambar lucha, pornography, semua masuk. And we got no right to regulate movies. Okay, I know some of you would like that, but the fact is that we have taken a cultural exception, means that the government still has got the right to regulate on cultural issues. And this relate to books, movies. Of course, it's difficult to wet the internet, but where the government has the ability to put conditions with regard to the circulation of printed or audio-visual material, we have taken that exception. Okay? Wholesale and distribution services. Here again, we have made sure that there are certain things that we have preferences given to only Malaysians. If you go to big department stores, for instance, hypermarkets. If you go to hypermarkets, there is a condition that you must have 30% Bumiputra equity. On top of that, your shelves must have local products or products from SMEs. Okay? If you don't know that, the next time you go to Tesco, Aeon, you will see that there are actually local products displayed. Okay? And that's a requirement. So these are the things that we have taken an exception. Okay? Rice, for instance, okay? Distribution services for rice. This is an exception we have taken because rice is essential commodity, price regulated. So we want to make sure that the distribution is reserved for, currently it is Bernas, but we don't know who is going to inherit Bernas later on, the role of Bernas. So that right is still now preserved, which means we do not have to depart from that practices right now through this non-conforming measure that we have taken. Air transport services. Air transport services is a very complex area of negotiations. Air transport services is not just about landing rights. It involves many other auxiliary services. Ground handling, for instance, catering, repair and maintenance. Okay? So in some areas we may have taken some commitments, but on a broad scale we have actually carved out air transport services. So these are some of the illustrations that I can provide you where Malaysia have taken a non-conforming measure and which gives us the flexibility to continue with our current policies and in some areas we can even go beyond our current policies and introduce new policy measures without having any repercussions on our obligations in the TPP. Okay? Let me move to government procurement. This is an issue, like I said, an important issue for Malaysia because this is the first time we are negotiating government procurement, and government procurement has been a socio-economic engineering tool for Malaysia, and that's one of the reasons why we have not opened up the government procurement market to any of our free trade agreements. But in the TPP, because government procurement is part of the scope of the agreement, we have to make commitments and take on obligations. Some of the obligations are actually standard provision. You have the rules that you have to observe, transparency provisions, due process. Okay? And according to the Ministry of Finance, by observing all these rules and disciplines, they can actually get value for money. Okay? Because these are certain rules that you have to observe in order for you to do your procurement. Okay? Not that the government has not been doing it. It has been doing it, but it is done on a voluntary basis, I would say. But now under the TPP, you are obliged to do that. You can actually be challenged by your TPP partners. Now we have opened up our markets in 3 areas: goods, services and construction. I'll show you the thresholds later. Now what are the entities covered? Now what we offer is only through those entities that are committed. If an entity is not covered, then that entity can still continue to practice whatever procurement that is doing now. Okay? It need not open it up to the TPP market. All federal ministries, including their agencies, and 4 statutory bodies in MITI. We are required under the TPP to open up statutory bodies. But because we find that most of our statutory bodies are not in a position to offer to be liberalized under the TPP, we have chosen those which are the most, I wouldn't say sensitive, but most sort of competitive bodies that do procurement. And they are 4 from MITI, Matrade, MIDA, SME Corp, and MPC, Malaysian Productivity Corporation. So these are the 4 statutory bodies. The rest of the statutory bodies, state governments, local governments are all excluded. Which means if you are from the state government, you can continue to do your procurement practice as you are currently doing. But if you are a federal ministry and your goods and your services are in the list, then you have to observe and open up the market. The Bumi-Putra policy that is preserved, I already mentioned to you just now under the horizontal issues, 30% set aside, margin of preference is maintained, and the central contract is maintained. Now, even though we have to open up the GP market, the benefit of negotiating GP in the TPP is now Malaysia can access other GP markets. In the past, we cannot sell our goods to the US government. No Malaysian companies can sell to the US government because we do not have a free trade agreement with the US. But now under the TPP, we can sell to the US government. In the past, US companies located in Malaysia can't even sell their own products to their US government. Okay? All those IT companies, computer, electronic products, Dell, Now these are companies, big companies located here, but they cannot export. They can export to the US, but they can't sell to the US government. So through the GP commitment in the TPP, we, Malaysia now, will be in a better position to draw in more investors to locate here if they want to sell to the US government. And our own producers can sell to the US government. Surgical gloves, US hospitals, boots, textiles, clothing for the US Army, okay? Now these are things which we are competitive in our production. So these are things that we now will be able to compete and sell to the US government. And US government procurement market is a huge market, okay? So the advantage of having our participation in the TPP, despite having to open up our GP market, we have actually now new opportunities to go into the US market. Next. Okay, these are the thresholds. These are the thresholds. It's important for you to understand what these thresholds mean. When we say we open up the market for GP for goods, services, and construction, it doesn't mean that the ministries will have to open up all its procurement to the TPP countries. Only procurement above those values you have to open up. Okay, for instance, you take goods. Goods, SDR. SDR here means special drawing rights. Okay, special drawing rights is a unit of currency used in the IMF, International Monetary Fund. The reason why they use that is because it's a standard measure. Okay? It's a basket of currency, so it will not fluctuate. If you use the US dollar will fluctuate. The yen will fluctuate. Okay? Or even the ringgit, it fluctuates. So they use the SDR. But we've given you what is the ringgit equivalent. So SDR 1.5 million is equivalent to about 7.5 million ringgit. So what this means is, in year one, if a ministry is procuring, say, drinks up to the value of 7.5 million, it need not open up the market to foreign players. You can still reserve it for Malaysians. You understand? Anything above 7.5 million, only then you open it up for foreign suppliers. That's year one. We've got a transition of 7 years, meaning after the 7th year, it goes down to 650,000. Okay? So anything above 650,000, you open up. Anything below 650,000, you can keep it for Malaysian suppliers. Follow? So the same principle works for services and construction. Now, construction, you notice that we start off with 63 million SDR or 315 million ringgit. After 20 years, not sure whether I'll still be alive in 20 years. After 20 years, it will come down to SDR 14 or 70 million ringgit. So anything above 70 million ringgit after the 20th year, you open up. Anything below, you can keep it for Malaysian contractors. You follow that? Now, we are the only country that has got such a high threshold. Even Vietnam, which never negotiated GP or government procurement in any of the FTAs, have committed up to 8.5 million SDR, I believe. That's about 8.5 is what? about 40 to 50 million SDR. Okay? So we are almost double most of the other countries. The other countries have taken 5 million SDR, Vietnam has taken 8.5, and Malaysia is taking 14 million. So in terms of flexibility, we still got very much higher flexibility thresholds than the other countries. Okay? So this is basically to allow for local participation in the construction sector. And this construction sector is only for government procurement. Please, anything outside government procurement, it is as practice free for all. Okay? Now, that's for Section A. Now, Section C, we have the same principle working, but slightly different thresholds, and we use the same transition periods. Okay? And the principle is the same. Anything above the threshold, you open up. Anything below the threshold, you keep it for Malaysian suppliers or contractors. Okay? Next, please. Labor. Okay. This is an area of interest to youths like you. You are worried that because we have a labor chapter in TPP, your jobs are going to be affected. Okay? Now, the TPP labor chapter is not about opening up the labor market. Please remember that. Despite what you read in the blogs, please remember the labor chapter is about creating higher standards for workers. Okay? And workers doesn't mean just the laborers. It's the whole workforce that can include people like you. Okay? Now, what again is being spread is that the labor chapter is about imposing US standards into Malaysia. No. This is about the ILO standards. We are an ILO member. You know what's ILO? International Labour Organization. We are a member of the ILO. So we have to observe ILO standards. Okay? So basically what the TPP is saying is that you observe the ILO Declaration 1998. The ILO Declaration is providing you with rights, principles that you need to observe and implement. The operative word in the agreement, the TPP, is adopt and maintain. Okay? It is not going and signing conventions. ILO conventions are more onerous. The obligations under conventions are heavier than just the declaration. So basically what it's saying is that you have to adopt and maintain some of the rights and principles like freedom of association, okay, collective bargaining, even rights to strike are provided in the ILO declaration. Then elimination of forced and compulsory labor, child labor, prison labor, okay, and elimination of discrimination in employment and occupation. So these are some of the rights that governments will now have to observe in the TPP. And these are basically relating to issues besides adoption of the freedom of association, the adoption now of issues like minimum wages. We already have minimum wages even before the TPP. Okay? Hours of work, occupational safety and health. These are some of the things that we are already implementing. Okay? And they are not US standards. They are all ILO standards. Okay? And we have got what we call in the TPP a bilateral consistency plan with the US. Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei. Now these three countries do not have an FTA with the US. And these three countries had problems on labor where the US have actually been monitoring. The latest was the human trafficking issue. Are you all aware of the human trafficking issue? And the US have actually put us on tier 3. Tier 3 means very bad in terms of observing some of these human rights issues. Okay? Now, because of that, they wanted to make sure that we will be able to implement our labor agreement in the TPP. So we have what we call a bilateral consistency plan. Okay? But the consistency plan is not just about implementing the obligations. It is also about cooperation. We have got provisions where we work together with the US to ensure that besides implementing the agreement on labor, that there will be actually cooperation, information exchange to help things like enforcement of some of our labor laws and so on. Okay? So that's why we have what we call a bilateral consistency plan. It is not exactly a part of the agreement, it is called a side letter. Okay? In the TPP, we have got the agreement, we have got schedules and annexes, and on top of that, there are a number of side letters which countries have signed with each other. So labor is one of those where we have a side letter. Next. Okay, SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary. This is a traditional chapter that you find in the World Trade Organization, okay, and in most free trade agreements. SPS is simply about making sure that when you come up with a measure to counter any risk that you will face as a result of a disease outbreak or transmission of pesticides, okay, insects, you will need to ensure that when you take those measures, they have a sound basis. You must have some scientific evidence. Only then can you impose some of these measures to protect animal, plant, and human health. Okay? If you have an outbreak of, say, foot and mouth disease in, say, Vietnam, okay, and if we happen to import, say, beef from Vietnam, we can actually take certain measures to control the imports of Vietnam until we are sure that there is no more foot and mouth disease outbreak in Vietnam. So these are kind of measures that fall under the SPS. And these are traditional chapters that you find in the WTO. The same thing applies for technical barriers to trade, TBT, regulations. Okay? Governments can impose certain standards, regulations to ensure that consumer safety is safeguarded. Okay? An electronic or electrical apparatus, say a switch or a plug, okay, you need to have a certain standard. So you specify what those standards are. But those standards have to be in line with international standards, where there is already an international standard. If you depart from that international standard, and if you find that this is actually a barrier to trade, it is a protection measure and not a consumer safety measure, you can actually challenge that government. Okay? So any technical regulation, you have to follow international standards. If you do not have international standards, then you will have to show why such a regulation is necessary. Okay? I forgot to mention, in the SPS area, our negotiators in the market access were able to carve out halal. Okay? A lot of people are reading today that TPP doesn't allow us to have our halal requirements. It's going to affect the implementation of Islamic requirements. This is all false. This is misinterpretation of the agreement. If you want, later on we can show you the exact provision where we have carved out halal from the SPS agreement, which means now as halal can no longer be considered to be an impediment to trade. It is a justifiable measure that we can implement. Okay? So all our requirements like going and checking abattoirs and making sure that they have a dedicated line for slaughter and all this we can have as a requirement for countries that want to export to Malaysia. Okay, so that's a very important flexibility or carve out that Malaysia has negotiated. So this is what we mean by writing the rules. So we have now gone into the TPP early, and we have negotiated, and we have the ability to write rules for the future. Imagine if we are not there. Vietnam is not going to fight for us. Neither is Singapore going to do that. Okay? So by being there early in the negotiations, we were able to do such things. Okay? Carve out areas of interest and concern to us. Okay, telecommunications and e-commerce. Telecommunications is another area which you already find in the WTO. Okay, this is basically about application of measures in telecommunications services, and it covers both the basic telecommunications as well as mobile telecommunication, but it excludes broadcasting services and cable distribution. Okay, this is an area which is, I think, because of security and sensitivity, they have excluded it. Okay, and here again, governments are allowed to have their own regulatory requirements. Okay, so long as they practice non-discrimination. Okay, that if you apply it to domestic provider, you must allow the same facility for a foreign provider. Now, e-commerce. Many of you, I think, are interested in going into business later on, and you know that the mode of business today is changing. It is no more doing retailing and expecting consumers to come to you. Today, you know, Alibaba.com is one of the biggest e-commerce vehicles that all over the world, traders all over the world use. Okay? Because this is a new form of doing business. Consumers, from business to consumers, even business to business, the mode today they use is e-commerce. It cuts a lot of time, service, okay? And you don't have to go out shopping. Now you do shopping all online. So the TPP e-commerce chapter facilitates people to not only develop businesses, but also to facilitate customers to access the e-commerce website. So we have got a lot of facilitation measures. We agreed that we will not impose duties on e-commerce transaction. So this is to facilitate business through e-commerce. Okay? And the e-commerce also ensures that there will be free flow of information, and that there will be no restrictions unless the government feels that for security reasons, for national interest reasons, it has to take certain measures and impose certain conditions. You can do that when the government feels there is a need to do that. Otherwise, there will be free flow of information, as well as location of computing facilities. Okay, you can't say that, oh, you must locate all your computing facilities only in Malaysia if you want to do business. No. You can do that if the government feels that there is a need to do that for security reasons. Okay, the government will say, no, you must locate it here for security or national interest reasons. Okay, you must have a valid reason. Otherwise, you can't put an imposition that, you know, today cloud computing. Okay, so there is actually no location of hard computing facilities in the site where you're operating. Okay, so those are provisions on telecommunications and e-commerce. Okay, I'm just giving you a brief background and the main provisions contained in those chapters. Next, SME. I told you that SME, we have got a dedicated chapter, and the chapter provides for a platform for greater cooperation among countries to help SMEs. Okay, there will be a dedicated website where all kinds of information relating to SME business will be in the website. Okay, cooperation and capacity building. Here, like I mentioned, these are capacity building initiatives. These are non-binding, no dispute settlement involved, but these are important capacity building tools that we have in the agreement. Okay? That's all? Okay, I'm coming almost to the last part of my presentation. In most agreements which are binding in nature, you need to have dispute settlement mechanisms. Okay? Now, dispute settlement mechanisms are important to ensure that people conform to the provisions of the agreement, people fulfill their commitments that they have given for opening up markets or ensuring a level playing field, and so on. Okay? So if there is a breach in any of these, then you need to resolve those issues through a dispute settlement mechanism. In the TPP, we have got two sets of dispute settlement mechanism. The more prevailing one is the dispute settlement mechanism on a government-to-government basis, G2G or state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, like what we find in the WTO. In the WTO, it is government-to-government, okay, state-to-state. And the procedure is almost identical to the WTO in the TPP, where you have conciliation, consultation as the first step before you actually go into a dispute mode and invoke a panel. Okay? So before going to the panel stage, you try to have consultation within a certain time frame and settle the difference. If you can't settle the dispute, then you go to a stage where you establish a panel, and the panel is again not an arbitrary panel. You have panels which are chosen by the parties to the dispute. Okay? And then if the panel comes out with a recommendation and a finding, the onus is on the offending country to implement the recommendations. The recommendation may say, revoke your measure or reinstate a certain measure, okay, whatever the recommendation is. Now, if the country concerned doesn't want to do that, they still have that option. They can continue to keep the offending measure, but each time you keep that measure, you will have to pay compensation to the affected country. You follow? Assuming Malaysia takes a measure and it hurts the trade of Australia. Australia takes us to a dispute settlement panel. The panel tells Malaysia, remove your measure. Malaysia says, no, I'm not willing to remove that measure. So Australia can seek compensation from us. Okay? So that's an option Malaysia will have. We can continue to have compensation paid to Australia. So in the long run, countries will decide whether it's worth their while to continue to pay compensation or just to remove that measure. Okay? So that's the purpose of the state-to-state dispute settlement, where governments take another government to task. The other form of dispute settlement we find is those issues related to investment, where an investor has an option. Either they take the government to task through a local court, or they go through a treaty tribunal that is established, what we call the investor-state dispute settlement. Next. Okay? Now, investor-state dispute settlement is a really hot topic where people have been using examples that come from all over the different parts of the world. And the reason why it gets so controversial is that they tend to generalize and say that, or in this case, billions were paid by the government, and that governments have lost cases under ISDS. Actually, the records show that it is not all the time the investor winning the cases. Okay? Now, it is not something new for Malaysia either. We've got 74 bilateral investment treaties. These are investment protection agreements. Of course, the scope of the investment treaties, the ones that we have done bilaterally, are narrower than the TPP, granted. But the fact is that ISDS has been provided already in those agreements. 74. I think this, for the last 30 over years, we have been negotiating bilateral investment treaties. Okay? Now, 8 of our free trade agreements also have got ISDS provisions. Okay? And the records show that so far there are only 2 cases that challenge the Malaysian government. And we also have 2 cases where our own investors have challenged other governments. Okay? So ISDS actually is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you allow investors an opportunity to take government to task, but on the other hand, you will also find that our own investors are going out today in a big scale. Do you know that we are no more a net importer of capital? We are no more a net investment destination. We have got more investments going out than investments coming in. More of our companies are going out. So these companies themselves would need the kind of protection that is available to investors here. Okay? And we've got not only big companies going out, we've got even small companies going out, and they too would need protection. Okay? Now, in the negotiations, we took on board all the criticism that was leveled at the ISDS. Okay? We took on board all those and we tried to negotiate safeguards. Okay? And the next slide, please. And post TPP, you will find that these are some of the safeguards that we have negotiated. I mentioned to you that the Commission, when it comes to the interpretation of the TPP agreement, the Commission will do the interpretation and it will be binding on the tribunal. It's a very important safeguard that we have now. Okay, so the tribunals can't just interpret the agreement as they like. Now, frivolous claims. This is another new provision that we have. In the past, you will find that a lot of lawyers, international lawyers, were free to go and lobby companies and say, let's sue the government. They will try their luck. Okay? But in this case, you cannot mount a frivolous claim. Because if you lose, and if it's considered to be a frivolous claim, then the investor will have to pay the government cost. In the past, there was no such thing. Okay? So this is a big change. And there is a time limit. 3 years, 6 months is all you will have as an investor to challenge the government. Once 3 years, 6 months passes by, you will have no more rights to challenge the government. Okay? And the proceedings this time are transparent. In the past, you hear tribunals meeting in some secret corner without any participation of the public. But now, you actually have so much of avenue. You have an open hearing. You have got amicus curiae. Any lawyers here? You know what's an amicus curiae? Third-party experts providing a brief on the subject matter for the tribunal to consider. Okay, so these are amicus curiae submissions, and it is going to be made public. The findings are going to be made public. So, tribunal members will now be more responsible in coming out with findings because they are under scrutiny themselves. Okay. And you cannot have different claims when the issue is the same. So you need to consolidate all your claims into one submission or hearing. Okay? And in the TPP, we have special provisions also on investment agreement and investment authorization. Investment authorization is subject to ISDS, but Malaysia, we do not have any investment authorization body. MITI is not an investment authorization body, okay? Investment authorization body, I think, is only found in Australia, I think in Canada, where every investment is authorized before it can actually be realized. But we do not have such a system, so we do not have to worry about that. But investment agreements have got certain limitations or certain conditions by which it can be subject to ISDS. For instance, if the government has got a contract with an investor and part of the contractual terms spell out very clearly that we will be using international standards, then we can say that this would not be again subject to ISDS provisions. Okay? So these are kind of safeguards that we have negotiated in the TPP agreement. All right? Okay. How much time did I take? A very long time.
Thank you, Dr. Jayasiri, for highlighting some matters in the TPPA. Now we would like to open the floor for 5 burning questions. Feel free to come forward to the microphones and please keep your questions short and sweet. Thank you.
So can we have the first question, please? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Azira Aziz. I'm from Badris, Malaysia. So I have 2 questions actually. One, why wasn't a proper and thorough human rights impact assessment done despite requests by various parties, including NGOs and civil societies, in Malaysia's involvement in TPPA? Which is because I understand Thailand declined to be a party of TPPA on the basis that they did a human rights impact assessment themselves and decided that it brings more harm than benefit to its people. Question 1. Question 2, in regard to regulation of internet in Malaysia specifically, what guarantee does Malaysia have that our privacy will not be compromised, i.e. espionage by government entities in our private lives? And any control on its citizen activities, because I understand that ISPs are required to block or stop access to certain sites, etc. Thank you.
Is Boran here already? It's coming, right? Okay. I will not venture to answer the ISP question. Borhan, who negotiated the IPR regime, will explain to you what are the provisions on ISP in the TPP and how it differs from what we already have under our own laws in terms of internet privacy. Okay? Now, on human rights, during our negotiations, this I must point out, we did not just consult stakeholders in the beginning of the negotiations or at the end of the negotiation. Throughout the negotiation, we were updating stakeholders and we were consulting stakeholders. So when it came to issues like human rights, we actually had a couple of sessions with Suhakam, okay? And they brought out certain issues with regard to human rights. And we answered those questions and said that, whatever that is being negotiated, at the end of the day, it is actually going to lead to better lives for Malaysians. The national interest analysis, which ISIS did, I believe also covered some of these aspects of human rights. Because most people think that the TPP actually suppresses human rights. I'm not sure why they come about with this kind of conclusion. Is it because they say, TPP is going to cause drug prices to soar, so as a result, human rights is going to be affected. But first we have to establish, is that a fact, whether the IPR agreement is actually going to lead to drug prices? Even without the TPP, drug prices are going up. So is that really considered to be a human rights issue? They say that because labor chapter is going to displace our workers, okay? I just pointed out to you that the labor chapter doesn't lead to that. Okay? So to answer your question, whether we have done a separate independent exercise or study on human rights, I concede we did not do such a thing, but throughout our consultation with the stakeholders, we have engaged bodies that were interested to put forward. Well, it's not just Suhakam. We engaged the HIV groups, all those cancer association, okay? And most of these people raised issues related to the rights of patients, and in a way I would sum that up as human rights.
Right, can we have the next question, please?
Assalamualaikum. Very good morning, sir. I'm Burhan. I'm a trainee at the Aircraft Maintenance Training Center in Subang. And my question is pertaining to me and my people, which are people who will be working in the aircraft maintenance industry. So basically, I want to give a brief telling of how it is that we have a licensing process, and is that the Malaysian license takes at least 5 years of licensing to get a proper license, and the European and the Australian licensing is only 2 years and 2.5 years at max. And so once we adopt the open skies policy and also the TPPA, operators such as airlines and also MROs, maintenance repair organizations, can basically open up their operating sites here, which means that they'll be liable to working here. And the problem is, it is much more convenient for them to hire their own people instead of our own, due to both the cost and the time needed to hire our people. So I want to ask, does Malaysia has any plan to work together with the International Civil Aviation Organization or maybe the International Aviation Transport Association in order to help us safeguard our jobs in the future in this field? Thank you very much.
Okay, just now when I explained non-conforming measures, I mentioned that we have taken a reservation and we carved out air transport services. Okay, so your issue will not be covered in the TPP. We are not opening up the air transport services. Okay, so we can keep whatever regulations that we have today. Okay, now with regard to your issue about the 2 years and 5 years, I believe this is something that we will have to take it up separately. It's an internal issue, and it has nothing to do with our commitments in the sector in the TPP. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next question, please.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Dinesh from Datuk. It's a advisory firm.
Sorry, I didn't hear your
Dinesh.
your organization.
Datuk. But today I'm representing YCM, Young Corporate Malaysian. In the report by ISIS, we see in at least 2 places that the consumer price for certain goods should reduce as a result of import duty that has been waived from import from the TPPA countries. What are the measures taken to ensure that this savings is passed on to the consumer rather than being kept by the businesses or probably Malaysian businesses? It's a question that would, I think, probably I could ask either MITI or I could ask the KPD and KK. MITI is there.
I think we must understand that prices of goods have got many components to it. Okay, sometimes prices go up because of currency movements, cost of production, marketing costs. There are many factors that actually determine the cost of a final product. Import duty is only one component. Okay, if you use pure economic theory and you say everything remaining the same, if import prices or import duties go down, prices should go down. When import duty is reduced, there will be many players in the market, right? It's not just one importer, right? So if one importer decides not to transfer the savings to the consumer, and if other players in the market decide to do that, so naturally you are going to lose out. Okay? So if in areas where there is actually competition, prices should go down. Okay? Now, there are products where we have not seen that happening because it is deliberate government policy. Do you remember when car duties came down from some 300% to 50%, I believe? Prices did not go down much because the cost of a car was, instead of the import duty, it was transferred to the excise duty because the government still wanted to maintain revenue, okay, and the revenue was transferred to excise duty. That's why the cost of cars today, if the excise duty doesn't change, if there is a reduction in the import duty, technically the prices should go down. Okay? I know I'm not giving you a guarantee that import duty must lead to lower prices. I can't guarantee you that because, like I said, there are many players in the market, there are many factors in the market that determine prices.
Morning. My name is Marcus and I'm from the Nation Building School. I have one question regarding agricultural subsidies which have been exempted from the trade agreement. You see, agricultural subsidies have known to be distortions, and it was removed because of developed country interests. And when these sort of subsidies are a benefit to emerging markets, like for example Malaysia, why was it not included in the agreement? Thank you.
Now, which subsidies are you referring to? I know which. Agriculture has got domestic subsidies, export subsidies. In agriculture, export subsidies, Shahril, confirm, export subsidies are removed in the agriculture chapter. No disciplines on export subsidies, which means they can continue to use export subsidies. Status quo, okay. Now, you see, export subsidies or agriculture subsidies in general is very difficult to be discussed within these 12 countries. The reason being, even in the WTO, subsidy commitments are one of the most difficult, okay? And it has been always a function of competition, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Latin American big agricultural players, okay? So it's been very difficult to remove subsidies. And in the TPP 12 countries, nobody will be able to take on commitments to sort of unilaterally dismantle subsidies. And if they do that, then they will probably be facing competition from countries that do not take on disciplines on subsidies. But there is some disciplines on export credits, right? Yeah. Shahril will explain to you afterwards the disciplines that we have on export credits, which is also a form of subsidies. And that discipline on export credits will actually put countries at a level playing field. That means you will not have an undue advantage by adopting export credits. Okay?
Right. One last question from the floor, please.
I just two quick questions. The first one is, as mentioned by the Prime Minister yesterday, what will or what has MITI or MITI been doing to help our SMEs, especially our SMEs, to go abroad? Because we're focusing a lot on our domestic preparedness, but what are we doing to help our business to go abroad, especially on the three sectors which TW expects us to really grow on, which is textile, DNA, and construction. The second one is, how much in line was the negotiators with our SOEs, especially on timeline-wise? Like, will it affect our JLC transformation? Is it in line with our JLC transformation plan of where they plan to go abroad, and does it really jive with the timeline?
Okay, on SOEs, Arunan will give you a little bit more detail on the chapter and the provisions, but in general, we do not have so much as timeline thresholds, but we have different thresholds to enable SOEs to continue to practice what they have been doing. There is a threshold of 500 million SDR and 200 million SDR, he will explain to you. And I pointed out just now that SOEs can still continue their developmental role. They can still continue to purchase from SMEs and Bumiputra companies. That itself is a form of helping SMEs to move up the value chain, because now GLCs can nurture the SMEs who are supplying them, so that the SOEs themselves are competitive. Because SMEs, GLCs don't want to be sourcing from inefficient producers and suppliers forever, and at the expense of losing their competitive edge. So in order for them to be competitive, they must make sure that the SMEs that they're sourcing from will also move up the value chain. Okay? Now, in addition to that, SME Corp has got a number of programs. You know, Matrade has got a program called Go Export, I think. I think that's the name of the program, Go X or Go Export. Okay, so these are grooming SMEs with potential to go abroad, and in fact there are dedicated trade missions that are organized by Matrade that bring in SME exporters. Okay, so that's from the export side, and SME Corp themselves are actually grooming companies. I think they have got certain tiers that are being established. The ones that have got the potential, I think their target is about 50 big SMEs to move up the value chain. So there are actually a lot of programs that, I mean, if you really want, we can link you up with SME Corp for all the various programs that they have, and you will find that most of these programs are geared towards upskilling SMEs, either in terms of good entrepreneur or corporate practices, technological advances, even marketing, branding, you know, and some of them are very specialized. So if you really want, we can link you up with SME Corp and Matrade if you are interested in the export area. Okay?
All right, due to time constraint, we will just take one more last question from this lady.
Dato, I'm asking a question on behalf of Azlan Awang of Banta, TPPA. So we're already making headways without TPP in the rubber glass sector, for example, like you mentioned, and also the textile sector is too low value add and can't compete with Vietnam. What is the gain that we're getting in the USGP market? Have MITI conducted studies on what are the issues and non-tariff barriers that Malaysian companies will face in the USGP market, and how much do you expect to gain?
Now, all we can say is that the first hurdle has been removed. In the past, we have got no access to the US market at all, the GP market. So the first hurdle has been removed by being in the TPP. Okay. Now, of course, the assessment of whether there are barriers to trade in the GP market is something which potential exporters will have to look at. Now, without referring to the GP market, the textiles market itself, the textile industries have already forecasted that because of the opening up of the textiles market and reducing the tariffs, they are already able to export, and their exports are going to go up. Now, in addition to that, there are also investment potentials. There are some companies that have been making inquiries to locate in Malaysia in order to be able to supply to the US market. So, on the one hand, you may think that textiles is actually a low value added, but the textiles and garment industry is actually in going by segments. There are high value added segments of the textiles industry, okay? And we probably will be concentrating on those areas of high value added.
Thank you, Dato Jayasiri. We would like Dato to remain on stage to receive a token of representation from our representative, Johan.